Hello and welcome to Boyd's Blue Alpine Freeze Drying channel. Today I will be finishing the rest of the chicken broth, which I had tried. If you watched my last video, you noticed that about half of the batch had so much fat in it that it just didn't freeze dry, and it's pretty much unusable as long-term storage. So we have found that it does work pretty well if we just reconstitute it with hot water and use it as a chicken broth. So for making, chicken dressing or something like that, it should work fine the next couple days, or maybe just using it as soup. So that will work, but today I'm going to try it with the remainder, about 3/4 of a gallon of chicken broth which was left over, which I've already skimmed the fat off the top. I let the pitcher sit in the refrigeration overnight, and it separated all the fat. There's about a 1/4 to a 1/2 inch of fat floating on the top of the broth, and I scraped that out. So now I just had the broth and I poured that into the silicone molds, which I am now going to place on the trays. I'll weigh them so I know how much the weight was going in. Then I'll run the freeze dryer and check the weight again to find out how much water actually came out of this batch without all the fat in it. So that's what we're going to do now. So I will just go ahead and put all the broth on the trays, and we'll start the machine to show you what settings I used today. As you can see, the chicken broth inside these molds has very little fat on top. If you remember the last batch I had, there was a layer of chicken fat floating on top of each of these molds, probably a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch thick. In this case, it's looking about the same color as it does all the way through the mold. So I suspect these are going to turn out a whole lot better than the last batch, which was so full of fat that it just didn't work out. So I'm going to place all of these on my tray. It probably looks like I'll just have 2 trays this time of broth, and we'll get all these spread out, and I'll start the freeze dryer. Okay, so for the chicken broth, I'm going to choose the liquid setting. Shut the valve, make sure the door is locked and closed, which it is, and the valve is closed. So I will reduce my refrigeration to just 15 minutes. I was only out of the freezer for about less than 5 minutes, so I don't think, and I didn't really touch it for very long, so I don't think there's going to be anything melted in there. I think it's probably frozen well enough. I just want to get the machine cold enough that in this first 15 minutes nothing does melt. So I'm going to leave it for the 15 minutes. And once that 15 minutes is over, it's going to run for 20 minutes, or 20 hours is the setting I've got right now. Okay, I came down and checked the broth today, and what I noticed is when I had set it originally for 20 hours, I noticed the mTORs were still around 230, 240, so I extended it for 2 more hours just to make sure that all the water had been taken out of it. So it ended up running about 23 hours. I think 24-hour dry time would be sufficient for most batches, depending on how thick you cut it. When I pulled it out, it looked really good. The smaller pieces that I'd poured were fantastic. The really big pieces, I did have a couple of chunks of fat. I remember when I put it in, there was a couple of pieces, I wasn't sure if it was a piece of chicken or a piece of fat, and those big chunks of fat that I didn't quite get out ended up being still in there. So I'm going to have to keep that part of the broth out and use it right away. I did find when I rehydrated some of it before that it works out to depending on the batch, this batch it's about 20 grams of the dehydrated per cup of water, and the other one was about 30 grams because it had more fat in it on the batch I was just temporarily using. So anyway, it works really good. It tasted really good with chicken stuffing that I made. And so it's really easy to rehydrate. I just added some hot water and I just put it in the microwave for 30 seconds, just warm the water up and stir it up, and it rehydrated beautifully in just a matter of seconds. So it's a really good broth. It worked really well. I learned the secret is stick it in a pitcher or a large container that you can put in the refrigerator overnight, and then pull off all of the fat. And you might, if I wanted some chicken chunks in there or whatever, but you might want to run it through a strainer before you put it into the molds of a silicone mold before you freeze dry it, because any fat that's in there is not, any chunks of fat that are left will not freeze dry, and they will just stay as fat in your broth, and you won't be able to store it for long term. So for long term storage, you definitely want to strain out all the fat. So refrigerate it, run it through a strainer, and any chunks of fat, get rid of it that way. And that worked really well though. So I've already packaged it, and I realized I had forgot to turn my microphone on, so I had to reshoot this without it, so you won't see any of the actual freeze-dried broth because I've already put it in packages again. But thank you again for coming and watching this channel today. If you're learning anything from this, or if you're finding it enjoyable at all, please subscribe. And if you know anybody who might be interested, please share this with them. Anyone might be thinking of buying a Blue Alpine Freeze Dryer or some other freeze dryer. This is proven to be really successful at freeze drying things about half the time as other freeze dryers. So thank you very much for coming, and have a good day.